Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Soulcast Media live event. If everybody can see me and hear me okay, if you can give me a thumbs up on your end or just write yes in the chat. I always have to ask this first question because with virtual events, you never know what kind of tech craziness can happen. So, like I said, if you can hear me and you can see me, welcome. Let me know in the chat that everything, the audio and the visuals are working okay. So, first of all, thank you so much for being here today. I'm so excited for today's event. It is going to be such a treat. But before we dive into this, I want to say welcome. If this is your first time joining one of my Soulcast Media live events, I want to say we host these about every other week or so. So, actually, quite often. And the reason why is because, well, everything that I talk about is always around communications. And I feel like there's just a lot to talk about when it comes to leveling up our communication skills. And every other week, whenever I host these lives, I always invite a fantastic guest, including like my guest here today, who I'm going to introduce in just a little bit. But we make this event all about you, meaning if you have any questions for us, you all have access to the chat function, which I know many of you are already utilizing already because I saw all the comments come in of where y'all are dialing in from. And it is so fantastic to see we have an international audience, which is amazing. But of course, here in the US as well, which is where me, including my guests, that's where we're located. But either way, this is the beauty of hosting an event like this. So, very thrilled that you are all here today. We're talking about communications and mental health at work. Now, before we dive into the conversation, if this is the first time we're meeting or you've been to many of my events, I'm just going to do a quick intro so you know exactly like who I am and why am I talking about communications. So, long story short, my career actually started in journalism. I was a former broadcast TV journalist for about 10 years here in the US. I was working, oh my gosh, I was working in Nevada, I was working in New York. My last stop was at the ABC station in San Diego, California. I think I saw some folks in San Diego here today, which is where I went to school. It's where I last reported, which again was at the ABC station. And that was actually where I won an Emmy Award. And it's funny because when I won that Emmy Award, I kind of went through this like career, like, oh my gosh, like what's going on? Like, is this what I want to continue doing? And it's funny when you win an award like that, which is considered one of the most prestigious awards in the industry, suddenly you can go basically anywhere you want. Like many opportunities start opening up. But for me, I actually made this huge, and it was frankly a very scary decision at the time where I was like, wait, I actually want to teach people communications because when I first started out as a journalist, communications was not something I was good at. I consider myself, more on the introverted side. I feel like growing up, I was also never taught communications or even how important it was to communicate, especially in a workplace environment. So I experienced a lot of what I call communications friction at work. But because I started off in journalism, and I always say it was like the best place to learn communications, that there's so much that I learned that I could teach it to professionals. So about 5, 6 years ago now, I left and I started my company, which is Soulcast Media. Hence, this is why this is a Soulcast Media Live. And this is what I'm so passionate about. I'm also really excited to say I have an upcoming book that is going to be released in less than 2 months. So I'm now starting to talk about it. But the book is called Smart, Not Loud: How to Get Noticed at Work for All the Right Reasons. It's my first book. It's a communications book, but it's very much a book for those who might resonate with what I call quiet traits and how you can basically stand out when you find that your workplace rewards and even expects being on the louder side. Like, how can you find that balance? But I'm not going to share too much about it today because that's not what we're talking about. I will be hosting future events around this book. So be sure to stay connected with me on LinkedIn because I'm going to be talking about it a lot. Okay, let's get started. I'm so excited to invite my guest up because we have a lot to talk about today. This is a topic I'm really looking forward to because it's about communications and mental health. So, my guest is Dr. Tzu-Mei Wang, and she is a speaker, a clinical psychologist, as well as a fellow author. So, Dr. Tzu-Mei Wang, welcome. I'm so glad you're here, and thank you so much for joining us.
I am delighted to be here, and I love already seeing the interactivity in the chat. So super fun group.
So I know I did a quick intro of who you are and the work that you do, but I'd love to hear it from you as well, including like how many years have you been practicing? Because you're a
Mm.
clinical psychologist, so I know you talk to many people, but do you have a specialty? Like tell us about the work that you do.
Yeah, so I think I was licensed in, I want to say 2010. So it's been a long time I've been in practice. And my specialty really is kind of working with individuals with marginalized backgrounds, especially Asian Americans or BIPOC individuals. But also, really, there's a focus on understanding how intergenerational patterns impact how we show up, whether in our relationships, in the workplace. So much of communication, I think, is rooted in our mental health state at the time. And so, one of the things that I always talk about with my clients is how does your mental health either enhance or actually inhibit how you communicate with the people you care about? So yes, and recently came out with a book a few years ago, Permission to Come Home, Reclaiming Mental Health as Asian Americans. Just one of the first books of its kind, really exploring mental health from an Asian diaspora standpoint.
I read your book actually not too long ago, and it was
Mhm.
funny because as I was reading it, I was like, "Absolutely, like, this is me." Like, and I love that your
Mhm.
focus was on Asian Americans because I think there are some unique experiences and in how we were raised, all our culture that and probably a bit similar to kind of what I talk about in my book. It's like, you're taught and told a lot of these things in your upbringing, and then you go out and you're
Mhm.
like, whoa, like, like this is not how it, you're supposed to. I mean, not really you're supposed to, but it's just like it's very different from what you kind of
Yeah.
expected. And therefore it becomes hard to be like, how do you authentically show up?
Mhm.
So, oh my gosh, I feel like I have a million questions already on my mind. But let's just start here. What got you interested in specifically, the focus that you do today? Like what your story basically, like what got you
Mhm.
interested in this?
Mhm. Yeah, so I mean, I came into the path of psychology in a roundabout way. I was actually a finance major in college. And this was largely just because my immigrant parents thought, if it's not law, medicine, or engineering, then surely, business would be the next practical career to pursue. And so in that, there was a lot of, I'm not sure that this is for me. And so it took kind of this path of figuring out, what? I love to talk to people and I love to engage with people in these very intimate and emotional ways. And so psychology offered a really beautiful marrying of, you know, um, understanding the human condition, trying to solve and understand human problems, while also enhancing people's livelihoods and the ways that they, choose to show up. And so then pursued my doctorate in psychology, and then went into clinical practice and have just really focused on trying to understand how we show up is informed by so much of our contextual system family experience. And so it was a roundabout path, especially being an Asian American, because we don't really focus on mental health. It's still highly stigmatized. And at the same time, realizing that our community needed um, clinicians and voices that reflected our experience.
So when you were talking about this earlier, you hinted at this, and you said the statement about how mental health and communications they're very much linked together. So, in your experience, in your practice, like what does that mean? And for our listeners who are here, the fact that everyone's dialing in and everyone's listening, I'm sure many of us think about mental health and proactively think about mental health, which is absolutely so important. But because this is all about communications and understanding the link between communications and mental health. Like, what does that mean? Like, what do you see?
So I see communication as the byproduct of an internal sense of knowing, right? So if you don't know necessarily who you are, what you want, how you want your relationships to be, then how do you begin to communicate with others, right? So communication is what bridges the boundaries between self and other, right?
Mhm.
And so much of how we live and live well is dependent upon how we negotiate the middle space between ourselves and other people, be it at work with your boss, your manager, director, with your colleagues, right? And then even at home with your own children, with your aging parents. There are
Mhm.
so many layers in that. And so communication has to be rooted in a sense of mental well being that is coming from a healthy place. because we've all been there when we are not feeling healthy internally
Mhm.
and the communication comes out very poorly.
Mhm. It's interesting because and I'll share my own like personal experience with mental health. And I feel like it's interesting because I wouldn't say it's like a constant state of any feeling a certain way. I think there are certain periods of time where my mental health is like, oh my gosh, like I feel so overwhelmed. I feel so stressed. I feel perhaps like, I feel more like impatient in many
Hmm.
ways, right? Because of just whatever's going on. And there are certain periods of, time where I'm like, I got this. Like everything's going well. My life is great. Every work is great. Family's great. The kids are great. Right. Like, and so I feel overall very happy. And it's interesting because you said this word, negotiating that middle space because, communications is the byproduct of how you're thinking and how you're feeling. So then the question is, well, if things are hard right now, right? Like if folks are going through a hard time, you know, their mental health is perhaps not as good as they would want it to be, and therefore they can sense their communications is struggling. They can't express themselves. They can't connect with other people, right? It's just like that disconnect. What would you say, maybe a tip or two for how folks can, I guess, step back and just try to like realign so that ultimately they can express themselves, communicate in the way they want to?
Mm, great question. And I think our mental health is grounded in kind of two primary aspects, right? There's the psychological and cognitive, which is mostly in the mind. But there's also the part of us that is the body, the nervous system, right? And so when we are under threat or stress, the body reacts. You might have kind of butterflies in your stomach or tension in the back of your shoulders and your neck. You might not sleep well. You might not eat well. There are all these kind of physiologic symptoms that tell us, oh, something feels miscalibrated, you know? And so sometimes, one approach is to say, how do we soothe the body so that it feels safe again in the midst of the chaos of life that always comes, right? And so in those moments, right, is it gentle movement? Is it deep breathing? Is it taking a walk between your working meetings? What are the things that your body can do to move through the stress response cycle into a more grounded place? There are different ways that people have found that are effective, right? Some people may get a massage, right, every month just to help work out that bodily tension, because when the body feels tense, the mind can sense it, whether or not you are aware of it consciously or not. And just like how when the mind is tense, the body responds and reacts. So you have kind of two approaches, right? You can try to think about ways and tools to calm the mind, things like mindfulness meditation, some people use, cognitive behavioral therapy strategies, right? Understanding the false narratives that you tell yourself that make yourself even more stressed or panicked. And then the physical, right? And that's how we can then start to shape the mind and body in a way where when we feel stressed, which we will, you can always find a way back to that homeostasis, which is that kind of place where you feel grounded, you feel calmer, you feel more peaceful. And the thing is, I always tell to people that is, we're not trying to remove stress from your life, right? Stress sometimes is positive, exciting projects, right? You're getting married, you're having your first child. These are inherently stressful events, but they're good. We pursue them because they're things that we want. And so our goal is to actually learn how to respond well to stress. And also recognizing that when the stressor is gone, the body is still in a stressed state. So let's say you have a project and you've delivered it, your body needs recovery now. And a lot of modern people, we don't go into recovery. We jump to the next thing, the next project, the next fire.
Why do you feel folks are, and I don't know if you see this, and I don't know if this is such a statement, but do you find that folks are just generally not equipped with the skills or even the self-awareness to realize this is how I should handle stress? Is that why
Mm.
mental health has become, maybe it's always been a thing? Of course, I'm glad we're all talking about it now, but why do you feel like I mean, I certainly was never like even those words, mental health, I feel like I've only really started to build awareness around it the last like 10, 15 years. Certainly growing up, it was not a conversation at home. My parents never talked about it. If you did, it was like something is really wrong with you kind of thing, right? So why do you feel like many of us aren't well equipped with, like you said, even just having that bodily awareness to know what to do next?
Mm. I absolutely think that these are all skills that can be taught, that can be practiced. But if you think about it, one of the short-term coping strategies that humans utilize is avoidance. When something doesn't feel good, the mind instantly says, let's hide from it. Let's avoid it. Let's not think about it. Let's ignore, right? So what happens is that our emotional life actually becomes something that we push to the side. Right? And especially in Western culture, there's a lot of emphasis on thinking. What do you think? What is rational? What is a right like logical explanation?
Mhm.
Whereas emotions are much more abstract. They're harder to get a handle on, hard to understand, and they're very overwhelming and stressful. So part of our inability to handle kind of mental health is that we push aside all the emotional data because it's inherently uncomfortable to tolerate. And so what happens is we don't ride that emotional wave to then come to the other side and realize, oh, that anger and resentment that I feel towards a colleague at work, that's actually data telling me that there's something that is not right in this dynamic or relationship or setup. And the thing with emotion is that it doesn't go away. It actually repeats itself again and again until you understand what that emotion is trying to tell you. And then you act on your life to make significant changes in it. Right. And so part of that is skills. And a lot of our parents never have the skills. We're
Mhm.
never taught the language of emotional literacy, never taught conflict resolution, never taught right how to understand how to communicate effectively. So we adopt the models that our parents have and we bring it forward until we realize some of these skills are lacking and perhaps we can do differently.
Yeah. I actually want to get a quick temperature check of the folks who are here, because we're talking about communications and mental health. The question I have for you, and you can let us know in the chat, when you think about what causes you to feel the most stressed,
Mm.
what is it? And let us know. And I think there's no right or wrong answer here. Is it typically work? Is it like the kids? Is it taking care of aging parents? Is it family? Is it just like what is it projects that you are assigned, maybe a manager that might be a bit difficult to work with, but let us know in the chat. I wanna know, like, when it comes to mental health, like, what do you feel like definitely takes a toll? Is it the deadlines that you always have to reach, the quota you have to, make, or what is it? Let us know. So, one of the questions that I have for you as, we're getting folks to share is I think about, you know, I can tell when my mental health is not good when I sometimes say yes to too many things.
Mhm.
And I feel like it might be part of like this, like you want to please everybody, you want to be seen as a team player, and then you start overloading your plate with all these projects, and you're like, oh my gosh, like there's just like so much. And then before I know it, I become like impatient, and then I'm like, and that's all I can think about. Anyway, so like because we're talking about work, and I know folks are going to be sharing kind of like perhaps the personal reasons or even work reasons, I also think overloading myself for me definitely stresses me out. But I also have found, and this was back when I was working, and I had a boss, having a boss who
Mm.
is, I guess, how should I say this? Like, not the easiest to work with. That can be also quite stressful. So, because we're on LinkedIn, and the work that I do is more around professional development. If work does tend to be something that does stress folks out, it is a huge part of our lives, right? Like,
Mm.
how does one manage workplace stress?
Mm. And I wish this was something that we could answer like very succinctly and concisely, right? But when you think about work, there is the actual work itself, right? Do I have the skills to do the actual work? Because if I don't, work is going to be very stressful because I'm going to always be feeling like I'm reaching or like stretching to get that
Mhm.
work done. So that's kind of one realm, right? Is the skills and the tasks itself. Then there are the relationships. Do I feel safe? Do I feel like I belong? Do I feel like if I admit that I'm having mental health struggles, that I'll be received well, right?
Mhm.
So there's that sense, right? The relationships. There's also this sense of like future trajectory of work. That could be stressful, right? And I think somebody mentioned it in one of the comments that like understanding where I'm going and if I feel stuck, that's inherently stressful too, right? So there are all these layers as to why kind of work related stress is overwhelming. And a lot of the time, we don't take the time to understand specifically what's stressful about our job, right? We're just like, work is so stressful. It's so chaotic. There's so much going on. Okay, well, if I was your therapist, I would say, okay, break it down for me. What exactly is stressful? Is it the work? Is it the people? Is it management and your career trajectory? What is it? And it could be all three. But until you identify that, you can't really take action to improve or change it, right? So then when you think about stress, like I want to be clear that like stress is not always bad, right? So stress is the way in which the mind and body rally to get things done. If you didn't feel stressed, you'd stay in your pajamas all day, right? If you didn't feel a sense of anxiety or stress, you wouldn't feel the motivation to meet deadlines and to get things done. So the question is, do you know how to harness your optimal level of stress to meet your optimal level of performance? Many of us over stress to the point where we're no longer performing well. And in psychology, there's this U-shaped, inverted U-shaped curve of performance and stress or anxiety. So in early levels, more stress equals more improved performance. At some point, it starts to come back down, where the more stress you have, the poorer your performance becomes. So the question is, do you know where your sweet spot is? Can you understand what the yellow and red flags are that are telling you you're about to hit that point where you're going to start falling off that curve, right? Most of us have never built out an understanding of how stress can be mobilizing and at which point it becomes problematic. So I would actually invite people to think about that. There are going to be warning signs that are very predictable, but we don't pay attention. Like you said, right? You just start piling on stuff. You notice you're more irritable when you get off work. Those are all signs that something is starting to feel miscalibrated. And the thing is, the earlier you can notice the miscalibration, the faster you can put in place actions to keep you from falling off that side of the curve, right? When we fall off that side of the curve, we experience self-doubt, burnout, disengagement, apathy, right? All of the things that are telling us you've pushed yourself beyond the limit.
I love that we're talking about this because, for all the folks who are sharing, what is it that causes me stress, really affects my mental health. I mean, thank you all for sharing, whether it's the workplace relationships, it's just, all the activities after work, my spouse and us not maybe being able to communicate. I think, the fact that we're having this conversation is such a positive. I really feel like, because how often do we even give ourselves the time to even think about this? So I want to say I'm grateful for you, Jenny. I'm grateful for all our, listeners who are here, because the fact that you're here and taking the time to even keep mental health top of mind is so important. Now, I want to share this thing that I was thinking about as you were talking about stress and performance, because in the communications work that I do, one of the biggest things we teach is presentation and public speaking skills. And as you know, and as many people may resonate, this is definitely something that stresses people out. And it's understandable. It can feel very threatening in many ways to stand up in front of an audience and present your thought, even though these are people who you are familiar with, your team. It's just that act of standing there and having people look at you is so unnatural. And I always say it's kind of the same thing. It's like, how can you take that stress? Because similarly, you need to feel a little bit of pressure You
Mhm.
do need to feel a little bit of pressure in order to actually public speak well. But the
Yes.
key is to change it from it going from completely debilitating and you are like stumbling and using filler words to being like, wait a second, let me try to use this anxiety and this stress as energy to
Yeah.
propel me to project my voice, right? So it
Mhm.
kind of reminds me similar to that you graph that you shared. You do need stress, you do need that pressure, but it's like, how do you find that sweet spot where you're like, okay, it's going to propel me, help
Mhm.
me, and not cause me to feel stuck. So I think all of us just have to find that. And, sometimes we're going to get it right. Sometimes we're not going to get it right. But I do feel the more you're aware of it and the more that you can actually control it,
Mm.
that's actually empowering it in many ways.
I love that idea, right? It's how you meet the stress,
Mhm,
right? That determines then how you will process it. So
mhm,
if I live life with the sense of like, oh my gosh, stress is so bad, it is so overwhelming, it makes me feel chaotic, then every time I feel stressed, that's how I will present and show up. But if I see stress as this is a necessary part of life, in fact, it's energizing. In fact, it gives me the motivation to do the things that I care about, then that's a really different framework, right, to approach the work that we do.
So, one question that I have in regards to communications and mental health is the act of when we sometimes are communicating with somebody, maybe it's our family, it's our parents, it's our spouse, it could be your manager. Suddenly, that conversation, that communications we're having turns contentious.
Mm.
When that happens, of course, it can affect our mental health in the sense maybe it's what they said to us, maybe it was very hurtful to us, maybe it just didn't land well. And again, like I said, then that can affect our mental health. So, in the context of feeling like we're not feeling so good during a conversation, which is the communication, how can one well, actually, what should we do if we
Mm.
sense that that's happening, where we're engaging with somebody and this conversation is not making us feel good, essentially?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think half the battle is awareness. Because a lot of times we don't even realize we're uncomfortable or we've been hurt. Our bodies are just reacting, right? And in that moment, the emotional centers of the brain, the amygdala, the limbic system are like, whoa, red alert. I'm pissed. I'm
Mhm,
so angry. I'm so upset, right?
mhm,
And what that does is it hijacks the frontal lobe, which is the rational thinking, decision making part of the brain. And so we can't even realize that we can step back or actually step away. And so that's why a lot of the early practices and
mhm,
figuring out how to handle conflict is actually learning how to self-regulate in conflict, right? Because if in that moment, just like public speaking, right, whenever you have a situation that brings up intense emotion, if you can learn how to calm the body just enough to put a pause and say, you know what, I'm realizing that I'm actually reacting really strongly to what is being said. And I just don't think I'm going to show up well if I continue this conversation right now. So I'm going to respectfully ask for a pause or a break so I can get a moment, right, to calm down and come back and talk about this again. That's enough, right, to change the trajectory of that conversation. But a lot of times we don't have the muscle developed to become aware, to set the boundary and communicate our need for a break. So we are just rushing headfirst, right, into the conflict without realizing that if I keep going, this conversation is not going to end well.
mhm. I love that, and it's just also in many ways giving yourself the permission to be like and say that, right? "Okay,
Mhm.
I know this conversation is getting heated, I can tell you're not, very happy, I'm not feeling great right now, so let's just take a pause." And even saying those words, "Let's take a pause, take a break, and cool down," right? And then we
Mhm.
can reconvene and continue the conversation. And I think what's amazing about us talking about this is, like, we can't always expect the other side to do that, right?
No.
They may not ever say like, "Okay, let's take a pause and come back to this." So in many ways,
Mhm.
you can say it, right? And it's you being proactive about it. And I think that is that is a skill. And I think you're right. It's like knowing and giving ourselves the permission to say that. And would you say this is also appropriate when we're engaging in workplace conversations too?
Absolutely. I think in the workplace, right, you might not have necessarily as much of a historical or emotional loading as with, for example, your parents or family members, but there often is some sort of relationship, and the set point in that relationship determines how you communicate, right? If this is a very close colleague and also a friend, that's going to determine how you handle conflict really differently than if this is somebody you barely know. They just got hired and now there's a conflict, right? So I think that's a really important piece in terms of being at work, is saying, you know what, like, I'm realizing that we might be talking in circles and we seem to be disagreeing over the same thing over and over again. I think I need to take a minute just so I can clear my head, think through kind of what I'm trying to communicate, and come back. And that's a really important piece, is the offer or the bid to return back to the conversation. Otherwise, it can feel like stonewalling, right? I'm just going to walk away. I'm done, right? This conversation is too much for me. That is not a really effective way to ask for a pause, because there's no connection back to having this conversation further.
This reminds me of, when I talk, so a lot of the work that I do, of course, is communications, but one of the biggest themes that I talk about is our ability to advocate for ourselves and advocate for ourselves in the professional setting, which usually includes like, asking for a raise, getting a promotion, pitching a project that you want to do, right? In many ways, this is what this is advocating for yourself. And I think in many ways, it's also tied to mental health, in the sense where, the confidence that you feel that you can advocate for yourself. And I think many of us, we struggle with that, right? And I think I'll take kind of like the cultural lens behind it. But, I grew up in a household where I was always taught, like, I was never really taught the purpose and the point and the importance of advocating. It was always like, if you just work hard, the opportunities will follow. If you just work hard, you'll get promoted. And I think it is true, perhaps the first few years, as like, maybe promotions are more structured, but you clearly see the higher up you go, oh my gosh, in many ways, it feels like it's a free for all. And the ability to advocate for yourself is really what can get you there and noticed and visible. And I think when folks maybe are entering the 5, 10, 15-year mark of their career, they start to sense like, whoa, okay, I actually do got to advocate for myself. But I think a lot of folks struggle with that, people of color, women. I mean, certainly for me, like, that was really hard to do. So let me ask, because we're talking about this idea of advocating for yourself and mental health, what would you say is maybe like the first few things one should think about to get into that headspace, to feel like they can advocate for themselves and that they should advocate for themselves?
I think that even before like the action of advocating, you have to actually believe you deserve what you're advocating for. And in truth, I think women, people of color, we have been conditioned to believe we're just lucky to be here. Right? You should take what's given to you. Don't push too hard, because they could replace you with someone else, right? So that sense of deservingness, right, is sometimes even hard for a lot of us to access. And if we don't feel like we deserve it, if we feel like we're an imposter, if we feel like we don't really deserve to be here, then we're not going to feel that sense of confidence to speak up and to ask for the things that we need. So I think it's really important to almost like take stock and be really honest with what you bring to the table. Because a lot of us, we minimize what we bring to the table. We say, oh, well, but this person does it better. Oh, they only complimented me because they kind of have to, right? See how we dismiss ourselves sometimes at every turn. I would say sit down with, a trusted colleague, your team, your manager, and get honest feedback about what you do well, what your skill set is, what you bring in terms of value to your company. That way, now you're equipped with your list of, this is what I bring to the table. I'm not just making this up that I deserve to move forward. I actually know this is what I, bring. And be specific. Bring examples. If you're a hard worker, what are the projects in which that was demonstrated? If you're a great leader, what were the qualities? What were the things that you did in order to show you were a good leader? The mind needs specific examples to internalize identity, right? And so every time we get a feedback loop where somebody says, you know, that presentation was done so well, and let me give you the top 3 reasons why it was done well. That is such valuable information.
Yeah.
So now I have my list. I hopefully believe that this list is a true representation of who I am. And now let me think about, what am I advocating for, right? You have to think about, what is it that you are looking for at the end of this self-advocation, right? We're not just going forward to say, oh, I deserve more, okay? What is it that you want? A lot of us, we're not clear about what we want. Is it, advancement? Is it promotion? Is it a transfer to a different department? What is it that you want? You have to get clear on that in order to ask for that, right? And then you have to practice making your pitch, right? And I would say this is where I talk about in my book, the hype team, your trusted group of friends, colleagues, even your siblings, your parents. Talk and practice the action of self-advocacy. Have them ask you questions. Have them play devil's advocate so you can role play the process of self-advocating. And also, while you're doing it, calm your body, because it's going to be scary to self-advocate, especially if it's not something you do all the time. But I think that will then get you prepared to finally meet your boss and say, hey, I've done my homework, and this is also what I believe I deserve. Now, we don't want to say, I deserve this, and therefore I should get it, right? We're saying, I'm actually deeply committed to this organization. I would love to see what advancement looks like. Can we even put together an advancement plan for me? And can you let me know what the benchmarks would be for me to show that I'm on track, right? That shows a level of investment in your team, your organization, right, your job. And that's very different than, oh yeah, I deserve it, therefore I should get it.
I love this because it reminds me of, well, you're right in the sense you can only advocate for yourself and if you're really clear on what is it that you're asking for, like why do you want it, why is this important to you. And in my book, it reminds me of, there's 2 chapters in the book and they're both relevant to what we're talking about. There's one chapter in the book that I call shaping your career brand, and it's a strategic way of approaching your career, because what I have found that for many of us, and I don't know if this resonates with any of you, where, we get hired for a role. We know generally what the job description is, and we do pretty well in that role. Like we get it done, like we're smart, we're capable, we're responsible. But because we're good at it, suddenly that just becomes what we're known for. Oh, Jessica, she's really good at this. Just let her do the project, right? And that's just suddenly becomes, the status quo. But even though you're good at it, it may not actually be what you really want to do. It just suddenly becomes the default for everybody to give you this project. I don't know if anybody has ever felt this, but I certainly felt this, where I found myself boxed into a role, certain projects that I was good at, but it wasn't necessarily a skill that I wanted to, that a skill that, could help me advance in where I wanted to go. So in this chapter of shaping your career brand, I basically challenge folks to think about their career in a more proactive way. And it's telling folks you absolutely can control how people perceive you in the workplace. And there's this whole 4-part step framework of how you can shape your career brand. And even when folks give you work you don't necessarily want to do, it's how can you still do it, but leverage it so that it's really helping you the way you want to do it, instead of just doing the work to do the work, right? So it's working smart. So that's a chapter in the book that I think is very relevant to what you just talked about, which is understanding what is it that you really want. And I think knowing where we want to go in our career is definitely step number 1. And later on in the book, I have an entire chapter on advocating for yourself. And I break it down into again, 4 parts. ACCT, and it's basically, the first A is advocating for yourself is asking for what you want, like kind of what we're talking about right now. Like you got to ask for it, right?
Mhm.
The C is circling back, right? That's
Mm.
because advocating for yourself isn't just saying it once or asking for it once. It's you got to know, you got to circle back and say it twice, maybe more than twice. And then
Yes.
the third one, the C, is you got to celebrate. Celebrate
Mm.
your wins, which I feel like a lot of times we don't give ourselves the time to do it. Like we're like, okay, yay, I finished it, and then you're moving on. But I think celebrating your wins, which is the third one, is also building visibility for yourself,
Mm.
letting your team, your manager know, like, hey, you're pretty awesome. Like you got this done. And it doesn't have to be in a showy, boastful way, which I know for me is very unnatural. I used to think like, oh, I don't want to do that. I don't want people to feel like, I'm just showing off. But I think there are subtle ways you can celebrate your wins, which I talk about. And the final one, which is the T, is advocating for yourself is also turning down requests. And that's the
Mm.
because turning down requests is also protecting yourself, right? Protecting the time that you have, because when you say yes to too many things, ultimately you're taking time away from the things that you actually want to do. So this whole conversation of advocating for yourself just reminded me of these two things, which I think are very important.
Mhm.
Um, Okay, I can't believe we're nearing the end of this conversation. I'm just having such fun, and you shared so many, amazing tips. So, as we start to wrap up here, and this is a question I always like to ask my guests, what's one, I call them golden nuggets. What's one golden nugget you'd love for our listeners, our audience to really walk away with today in regards to communications and mental health at work?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most powerful things for just mental health, but I think also communication to learn is learning that emotional regulation piece. And I think that's why, in my book, I put it so early on in all the chapters. Because if you can't regulate your emotional life, you will struggle through conflict. You will struggle to self advocate. You will struggle to say no. You will struggle, right? Because you will feel bad, and that negative emotion will impact your behaviors, right? But if I can calm myself down enough, right, to maintain that boundary because I feel like it's necessary for me, then you'll be able to do that thing, right? You'll be able to say no much more easily. And so I would say, do you have the capacity to hold negative emotion inside of yourself without getting overwhelmed by it, without trying to ignore or dismiss it? Because that tolerance of discomfort is such a valuable tool in terms of navigating all these very complex situations in your life, communication or mental health included. So I think that's such an important skill set to learn for all of life. And if you have kids, this is something I hope you will teach them too, because they will become much more well-rounded, well-regulated individuals.
I'm so grateful for you, Jenny, and I'm so grateful that you were able to spend this time with us. And, like I said, the fact that we're all here, we're listening, in many ways, I consider this, we're taking care of ourselves
Mm.
in tuning in and listening. Because how often do we give ourselves the time to just sit back and think about just the topic of mental health? So the fact that, you've all dedicated the last like 45 minutes or so to listen and just learn and just even like be introspective and internalize the things, like I guarantee just this conversation alone, hopefully it'll make you feel better and know that you absolutely can control, and there are things you can do to make yourself feel better in those times of stress. So for
Mhm.
folks who want to follow you and get connected with you, what's the best way to do that?
You can follow me on social media at Asians for Mental Health. You can also check out my website, jennywangphd.com. It has access to my book as well as other ways to reach out to me. Thank you so much, Jessica, for making this time and creating this space for everyone.
So if there's two call to actions I could ask everyone, go please connect with Jenny, buy a copy of her book. I've read it. It's fantastic. The other call to action is, so I mentioned my book is coming out soon. If you're interested in the book, which is called Smart Not Loud, how to get noticed at work for all the right reasons. We have a website. It's literally the book, smartnotloudbook.com. you can go to that website, you can pre-order it now. And, we're doing a lot of very special events leading up to the launch, which officially launches July. But I'm like, why wait until July to like start accessing all this stuff? So if you pre-order the book, we're hosting actually several private communications workshops for those who pre-order it. So go pre-order. It's actually also on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. Again, it's just you type in the book Smart Not Loud. And as part of like some of the things we're doing upcoming with our Soulcast Media Live. So, Jenny was here today. And like I said, I host these every other week or so. The ones coming up after this are actually all going to be around the book. So if you're interested in attending those Soulcast Media Live events, there's a QR code here on the bottom. Go RSVP because that's how we communicate with you to let you know. We're going to be hosting several of these Soulcast Media Lives around the book. So, Jenny, thank you so much for being here with us today. And thank you all so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed this session. And I look forward to seeing you all soon at our upcoming event. So take care, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.